My name is Jenny Anders-Gable. I'm an attorney with Legal Services of Northern California, another legal aid organization like the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. I am here with experience and background doing disaster work and FEMA work, and I'm also here with my role with the Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative, a statewide group that provides support to attorneys and individuals experiencing legal issues after a natural disaster. Uh, I've been helping and supporting the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles with some of the disaster work, and my colleague Stephen and I are both happy to share with you some very basic tips and an overview of the FEMA appeals process, really so that you have a sense of what the timelines are, what you might want to consider in an appeal, how you may want to engage with FEMA to kind of understand their letters and try to ultimately get something or more FEMA assistance than you may have already received. This is the stuff that we will be going over today. As you know, we'll also have a portion at the end where we will be able to answer some general questions and answers as well. Hopefully a lot of that is addressed here, but please, take note if there's more that you want to know that you haven't heard. Hopefully by the end, the goal is at the end of this overview, you feel a little bit more confident or comfortable with how you can engage with FEMA so that you're able to get them to approve what you're asking for you to be able to get additional assistance from them or continued assistance from them. So I think probably a lot of folks who are joining right now have already applied for FEMA. As you know, the deadline to apply was March 31st. If you did not apply, or if you know folks who have not yet applied, there is generally still a 60-day grace period. So it's actually not too late to apply for FEMA if you haven't yet. But you'll have to give some explanation why you were late in applying or why you're past the deadline, some good cause there. But what we're mostly focusing on today are people who have already applied in some way to FEMA. Maybe you've received some assistance, maybe you haven't received any assistance, and it's really trying to understand what more you need to do or provide to FEMA in order to get some benefits. Really, FEMA is designed to be really easy to apply or to access. You can hop online. Most people actually do apply online through the portal. You maybe went to the Disaster Recovery Center, you applied in person, you could even apply on the phone. That's all good. It starts an application really quickly, but a lot of times FEMA doesn't receive all the information that they need in order to make a complete decision. And so what they will wind up doing is sending you letters. And oftentimes it's a lot of letters, and sometimes they're really easy to understand, and a lot of times they're not really easy to understand, or it's confusing because you will receive one notice that says they need more information, and then a week later you receive another notice that says they need more different information, and you don't know how those letters work together. And so the key is really knowing that you need to be reading all of those letters, and sometimes, or a lot of times, that's overwhelming. Fortunately, there's people who might be able to help with deciphering what these notices mean, but really paying attention to the notices, because most of the time what FEMA needs is just more information in order to decide whether you're eligible or what you're eligible for. If you don't respond to those letters, some of those letters will say you have to respond within 60 days, or if you don't eventually respond to those letters, they will often send you like a follow-up letter. You'll also likely receive a letter that says you haven't responded to the information that we needed to be able to assess if you're eligible for these benefits, and so we're determining that you're not because we don't have enough information, and they'll give you 60 days to appeal that decision. And so this slide here is really about how much time you have to get in an appeal, and we're going to tell you or try to explain to you what an appeal means. In a lot of ways, the rules have changed recently to make it easier, and so merely responding with the documents that they want. For example, they might say, you said you have insurance, give us a copy of your insurance policy. They want to make sure that the insurance is not covering what you're asking for, or is not enough for what you need. And so if you provide them the insurance policy, that could be your response. That could be your appeal. And that might be all they need in order to say, oh, you're right. Your insurance didn't cover anything or enough. Now you might be eligible for this FEMA assistance, for example. You generally have 60 days to appeal, to give them the extra evidence or documents that they need. They will attach an appeal form. We'll have a picture of that later in the slides that you don't have to use, but they make it pretty easy if you want to just write out. Sometimes you have to explain what they don't know or why they're wrong. If you want to write that out in that appeal form, that's a nice, clean way to submit an appeal, but it's not a requirement. You can, again, just send them what they're asking for. You could write it out by hand. They're willing to accept anything as an appeal, but it is important that you let them know that you disagree with their decision, or need more time or need more information. Same with the application deadline, the appeal deadline. You can appeal beyond the 60 days, but you'll want to tell them why you're late in appealing beyond the 60 days. Once you've given them more information, or once you've submitted an appeal, they need to respond within 90 days, and they will generally send you a final decision, another letter that you can find uploaded to your account, but they should also be mailing that to the address they have on file. So it's important that you check the mail. The final is in those quote marks, because another important thing that we want you to know after today is that you can keep appealing. You can keep giving FEMA new information. If they respond to your appeal saying they still need more information, or you're denied because they still don't understand, the facts of your situation, that doesn't mean it's the end of the road for you. If you have more proof, or if you have more to say, you can keep that conversation. You can keep those appeals going back and forth, and you can really do that for really 18 months, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So it's important to know what happens when you give this information to FEMA, or when you upload something into your online account. Like, then what happens? I think one thing that's really useful to keep in mind is that FEMA has a bunch of different departments. So it's not necessarily one person. It's, that's one name, it's FEMA, but part of why you get so many different letters asking for different pieces of information is because there's different groups within FEMA who handle the different pieces of recovery. And unfortunately, it's not coordinated as well as it could be, which makes it, a little bit or a lot confusing to try to navigate. So knowing that they send you a bunch of letters, they want a bunch of information. If you can provide that all at once, great. If you provide it at a bunch of different times, that's fine too. But knowing that the person who's reviewing it might not know your full story, might not know all the issues you have going on. And they're also not an attorney. So I think sometimes people think they need, it sounds very formal. The word appeals might sound intimidating. You think you might need a lawyer, or that you might need some, very formal or fancy form. For better or for worse, that is not true. And the person who's going to be reviewing your appeal or reviewing your final file, they are not an attorney either. So you really do want to present this as simply as possible, because they're somebody who's dealing with a lot of work, who doesn't know your whole story. And so as simply as you can say, I did not have insurance, or I did not, this person did not live in my household, or this was my home, but I inherited it and I didn't change the title, whatever the situation might be, as clearly as you can present that. You don't need a lot of words, and you don't need for it to sound very lawyerly, and it's not going to be read by a lawyer. So I think that's good to know. They're going to be reviewing your file in theory. You're hoping that they're reviewing everything there. A lot of times they might respond and ask for more information, like I just mentioned. So you might give them information, you might give them an appeal, and it still might not be enough. So they might either deny it, or they might ultimately ask for more information, for receipts, or for copies of a lease agreement, or for an insurance payouts or whatever it might be. They might still need more because what they're trying to do is to make sure that that the losses that you incurred or anticipate incurring were due to the disaster, and that you haven't already received any other source of financial assistance to cover those losses. Because at the end of the day, FEMA, they're the helper of last resort. So if your insurance or your friends or other the Red Cross, other people have already paid for you to replace your car or for you to have housing or whatever the example might be, then that might not be something that FEMA would cover, because they're there to really fill in the gaps where other support isn't coming through. It's also important to know that you can request a second inspection, and that might happen in this process. It's also something that you can do before you appeal, or simultaneously. This is, I think, most applicable for people who have smoke damage, or your home may not have been completely lost in the fire, but it's not currently habitable or doesn't currently feel safe to live in. And the inspector may not have seen everything that you thought they should see, or they may not have decided the way you thought they should have decided. And so knowing that you can request a second inspection, I think, is also very important. Yeah, and I think I mentioned all of this already, but knowing that once you lose within FEMA, once they say no, there's not like another court process for you to go through. But as I've said, just because they come back the first time or the second time or the third time with a no, or with we need more information, again, you can keep having this conversation and this back and forth with them for 18 months, for a year and a half after the disaster. So there is eventually a hard deadline, but knowing that right now you're in a window where you still have a lot of time, and I'm sorry because it does take it's work and it's energy, but you still have time to have this ongoing exchange with FEMA. And that's a very routine way that these matters get resolved, because again, a lot of times it's just needing to connect the dots better. So FEMA has the assurance, they're comfortable knowing that, again, this was all caused by the disaster, and that you haven't otherwise, that you lived in the unit, that it was your primary residence, and that you haven't otherwise received compensation or support for whatever the losses or additional help that you might need. When you're preparing your appeal or your response to FEMA in response to these letters or negative decisions that they've made against you, it is good to review and request your FEMA file. In the perfect world, you would have that file before you submitted the appeal. Since we don't live in a perfect world, you might want to request that at the same time that you're also giving them the documents that you've that might be responsive to what they are asking for. And because depending upon where you're at in your appeal window, you might want to just get the appeal submitted so you get something submitted on time, but you also should request your file. Sometimes there will be notes in there from the inspector or other clues in there that might help you understand why they've made the decisions that they've made. And again, to the extent you get new information from your review of your FEMA file, you can go back and give them more information to say why they're wrong, or what they might be missing. And so even if you did that after the 60 days, that would still be fine. Sometimes these issues can be cleared up just by chatting with FEMA. Maybe some of you have already done that and you're thinking that is easier said than done. Maybe some of you have done that and you're like, yes, some of these issues can get resolved with a phone call. While FEMA is still at the Disaster Recovery Center, especially now that they're not doing like a lot of application processing, the folks there might still should still be able to give you some guidance, some assistance. You could, some of these documents that they need, they might be able to still accept and process right on the spot. That might be easier for some of you to do this in person. It's really nice while FEMA is still in town, which they are still at the 2 disaster recovery centers. I don't believe there is an end date that is publicly stated yet. But knowing how these things generally go, I would anticipate they are winding down. So I would seize their presence if that's of interest to you while you can. Otherwise, the phone calls, you can reach them actually fairly easily by phone, especially compared to some other government bodies. And that might be a way to try to resolve things, or at least to try to get clarity on what exactly they are asking for. So don't shy away from actually just reaching out to FEMA directly to try to understand what they want. And again, really the key is that you're trying to find or locate or understand what extra proof or evidence or support that you need in order to make it very clear to FEMA that that these are benefits that you are eligible for and that you in fact need to support your recovery. I think I'm going to pass it over to Stephen now.
All right. Good morning. My name is Stephen Morris. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Services of Northern California, and I assist with a lot of the disaster response up here in Northern California. And I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the kind of nuts and bolts of preparing an appeal, and keeping all those timelines and everything that Jenny's kept discussed about in mind as well. So this here is kind of a snapshot of the middle of a denial letter. Um, you'll get one of these, like Jenny said, in the mail. Can show up on your disasterassistance.gov portal. But it's important to read it and read it carefully. This is a kind of the middle section of it, explaining just exactly what FEMA is denying for or not approving for in this case, and what they kind of need. So this one it says no decision. So that means they have not actually denied, but they are looking for more information to make their determination. And you see in capital letters, that's the code that was mentioned earlier. All these letters will have that kind of letter code included, and FEMA actually has a list of that on a PDF on the website. In this case, it's INS for insurance and an HA for um, housing assistance. So they're looking at insurance for the home to see if you are able to get a grant for uh, home repair or home replacement. So it just explains, you know, they need more information. So go to the bottom of the paragraph, please send a copy of these documents to FEMA. The letter goes on to kind of bullet point what is needed. I will point out that the middle paragraph, because this is from an older disaster, that middle paragraph I don't think should appear there anymore, except that they are limited the amount of money they can give you. But one, the dollar amount has gone up for 2025, and also that there are new rules about how insurance works with FEMA assistance. So that's another thing to bear in mind as you move forward. Okay, so when you are dealing with an appeal, or in this case, a request for more information, you have a friend that can help you, and that's the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, or IAPPG. This is available on FEMA's website, and it's basically a pretty lengthy booklet that explains basically everything in the individual assistance program. For most appeals, basically, you're going to look at Chapter 3. That's the Individual and Households Program. That's where they're actually talking about the type of assistance that folks affected by disasters get. So, that's where you can kind of go to as a starting point to understand if the letter's not clear, or if you've talked to FEMA, or you just want to make sure you're being thorough, that you can kind of see what the criteria are, what the rules are, what's needed in terms of documentation for a particular type of assistance. And there are kind of three main kind of buckets that a lot of the appeals can fall into. Your kind of overall general eligibility for individual assistance. That would be, verifying your identity, making sure that, the applicant in the household is a qualified individual, that you resided in the disaster declared county, et cetera, that you have damage, those kinds of things. Then there can be eligibility for specific assistance types. So that's where those codes come in handy, because we saw like INS HA. So we know this is a housing assistance, because it's possible that you applied for a lot of things, that you had medical expenses, you had, damage to a vehicle, you had damage to your home. The appeal letter is going to be specific a lot of times, or it will have paragraphs for each particular issue that they are coming with. So it's important to look at those, know what they're asking for, and know, what the specific criteria are. And so there's housing assistance for anything basically with your home, and then other needs assistance for all those different types of expenses or da losses. And another kind of broader third bucket as well can come into play is the kind of the amount of damage or demand of damage award, the amount of your insurance settlement, if any, and the maximum award that FEMA can give you for this program. The only kind of additional wrinkle to this situation is that program policy guide, if you saw on the last slide, says May 2021. And since then, there's been a bevy of reforms and changes to the individual assistance program that make a lot of these things generally better for disaster survivors. And Jenny's already discussed some of those with some of the adjustments to the timelines and late application periods and things like that. But in the actual kind of substance of what might be required for a particular situation, or what the issue is with the amount of an award, you can't rely solely on the program policy guide anymore. There are reforms, and I think we have a link to that as well. But broadly speaking, a couple of the big points are like things like the definition of what means uninhabitable is changed to be broader, more favorable to disaster survivors. Another big point that's gone on here is the accessibility assistance. So before, FEMA would look very strictly at what was the condition of the home beforehand and what needed to be repaired from storm or disaster caused damages. Now, with the reforms, if you have an accessibility issue because of a disability or something like that, um, you had a ramp needs to be replaced by this, because of the damage. That's normal. But if you needed a ramp beforehand and didn't have one, FEMA awards can actually now help provide those accessibility needs to your home. And with insurance, homeowners can get housing assistance basically now, even if the amount of the settlement, the payout from the insurance, is equal to or more than the 43,600 for 2025, which is a big change from before, because it used to be that it would just max out. So if your insurance settlement was more than the FEMA award, that was the end of the road. Now they're going to look at how much damage was there to the home, and if it's greater than 43,600, even if your insurance covers all that, if there's a gap, basically, FEMA can now assist with that. The other addition here at the bottom, you're not required to apply for an SBA loan before being considered for the other needs assistance. But especially if you have a home that was affected by the fires, an SBA loan could be a helpful form of assistance, because FEMA only will provide 43,600 in housing assistance. So obviously, in terms of replacing or repairing a home, that's not necessarily going to go very far, even with insurance. So especially if it's a rebuild situation, an SBA loan can be a way to get a very low interest loan to repair or replace a home. So if you haven't applied for SBA, and I think they have similar rules. I think Jenny has some information on this, but the similar rules to if you've missed the window, you might still be able to apply. And it might even be extended later than FEMA, because it's a separate period and declaration from FEMA itself sometimes. And then just kind of blew through at the top, but the deferred maintenance issue, which is basically when there was what the inspector has found as damage to the home that was not caused by the disaster. So, there was some, there's dry rot under this wall. Previously, we ran into this a lot up in Northern California with the winter storms. They would say this was not storm caused, it's deferred maintenance, and we're not going to give you money to replace it, but the contractor's not going to do any work on the home unless they can replace that as well. So some people were left in the lurch where they could not afford the contractor to fix anything unless they were able to find separate money to pay for those repairs as well. So home repair assistance has gotten a little bit broader now. They're basically looking at looking at is the home safe or sanitary, which should generally be more helpful if you're looking for home repair assistance. But the big note here is just that that program policy guide, not everything is going to be 100% accurate with the new reforms that went into effect last year. So um, keep those in mind and potentially, seek advice if you can, if you think you might be in that situation. So here's just an excerpt from the program policy guide. This is the page on continued temporary housing assistance. So if you're displaced and you need a place to live in the short term, you can basically see the bullet points. There are 5 bullet points there. That's the criteria you need to meet. And, it might be the denial letters on one of these, it might be on all of these. So, but this is where you can go to kind of see like what is the overall rule for this specific type of assistance. And when you're putting together the appeal letter, this can be your kind of template. This is how you can take the facts of your situation, line it up with these bullet points, and essentially spell it out. And then you can see there on number 2, it'll go on to list required documentation that you need. So that can give you a broader explainer because sometimes these denial letters can be a little hard to understand, kind of limited in what they're saying because they're usually pretty short. So if you need a written longer explainer of like, okay, this is how do I understand how this part of the program works? You can always refer to the program policy guide. Um, when you are kind of outlining and drafting what goes into an appeal letter, if you're going to provide an explanation, like I said, this can be your template. So you can basically state what the rule is and apply the facts of your specific situation, what your documents show to basically show the FEMA employee reviewing your appeal why you should be awarded additional assistance or why you should be awarded this type of assistance, et cetera, to basically show that why you should um, be able to get more help. So here's just an example of kind of taking that process and applying it. This is a home replacement assistance case that I worked on. I helped prepare an appeal. And you can see on the left, page 91 of the policy guide explains what all of the conditions for eligibility are. First being generally eligible for individual assistance, and then there's kind of the 6 bullet points of what has to have occurred with the home for an individual household to be available eligible for home replacement assistance. This is when the home is basically damaged beyond repair, or essentially a total loss. So what we did is basically took the rules, and I actually took this from the federal regulation that actually outlines it. But the program guide is helpful because it just puts it in very clear, plain language, which is what's helpful for you as a survivor and helpful, I think, for the FEMA employee reviewing your appeal because, like I said, they're not going to be an attorney. They're not going to have legal training. They're going to have a little bit of training in the program, but not necessarily like going to be deeply knowledgeable in this. So looking at the letter on the right, I just took the rules of eligibility for the program and applied the facts of the situation. And what you recommend doing in these situations is you have what the eligibility rules are, and you have some places you reference them for. Don't rely on the FEMA employee working on your appeal to necessarily have that up in front of them, but you want to basically make your um, appeal letter kind of a closed book, a closed universe that has everything that they need to make a decision. And so what I did is I put the criteria language in italics there. This is what it says. I cite the page 91 of the PBG. I put quotes in there of the language and then include next the fact situation. These people made these inspections and found that it's, in imminent danger of collapse and it's a total loss. And then I reference the letter that they prepared that's included in here as well. So that way the FEMA employee is going to be looking at this and knows that they can then turn to this page. They see the language in front of them of what standard is being applied, and basically you can then put together 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Therefore, I am given information that shows that I've satisfied the requirement. And so when you are you've looked at the appeal letter, you may refer to the program policy guide and the reforms to get an idea of overview of the situation. Now it's kind of like collecting evidence, collecting documents that you need to, you know, prove or supplement or provide the information that FEMA's requesting. Um, you want to, of course, find whatever's the best possible evidence, kind of like, the primary thing, hopefully not like a secondary reference to something. Make copies of them to include, like I said, you don't want to put something, say, over here in this part of the file and just by reference. You want to like have it attached to the letter essentially. Um, you want to label it that way. If you have something like a receipt, you can put it down as, item 3 or exhibit 3, and then in your letter, you just put in parentheses, see exhibit 3, and that way that officer knows where exactly to look, what you're talking about. Include any pictures you can from before and after the disaster event. Um, this can be tricky for before pictures just because, you don't necessarily take pictures of like all parts of your house, a month or two before a disaster strikes because you just, well, I don't do that anyway, but it's probably not a common practice. But you might check your camera rolls, check your family's camera rolls. Anyone take pictures of the living room? Did Uncle Larry visit, last Thanksgiving? Did you guys take a picture that's on his camera? Can they send you that to you? Perfect. You can print it out, or scan it, put it into your appeal, especially when you're looking at like disaster caused things. You can provide in a very clear form what the condition of the home was before the disaster, picture of the car before the disaster, etc. Um, Gathering other things like receipts, estimates, utility bills. That's just something to keep in mind generally as you're going through kind of the recovery and rebuild process, is keeping documentation of expenses that you've incurred, receipts for repairs, contractor estimates. If you're doing rebuilds on anything, are going to be critical for FEMA's determination of like how much assistance is being given. So you want to make sure you get, copies of estimates that you get from contractors. Utility bills are helpful in situations like occupancy to show that you were living in the home just before the disaster occurred. So as much as possible, like even the period where you aren't dealing with a appeal letter from FEMA, keeping those together, in like an accordion file or something like that, or particular, hard drive folder. That way you can, when you need it, it'll be there. And then additionally, kind of as an overall thing, is keeping all of the key relevant documents from your FEMA file in the appeal letter. Like I said, it should be a closed book exam, essentially, a closed universe, so that you aren't relying on that FEMA employee to know that, oh, you know, they mentioned their February 2nd letter that they sent to FEMA. Let me go pull that up and find it in the file. No, you should just say, in my February 2nd letter and attached as item 7, and then you put a label on it and you put it with the other documents in your appeal response. And that way, again, they can just flip right there and see it. And then you can also include third-party statements that you might need. I think generally, any statement made to FEMA should be under the penalty of perjury for them to consider, and it just means that they, it basically kind of like a sworn declaration. If you have questions that you might be able to seek legal help, get advice and counsel on that. But again, the big takeaway is just don't expect the FEMA employee reviewing your appeal to have any familiarity with your case at all. And don't expect them to go find outside information, whether that's the policy guide criteria or previous letter or previously submitted insurance paper. So they might, send you a request for the claim that you filed. You can also just include the insurance policy as well to make sure that that is just there, because you're not going to necessarily you don't want to inundate them with information, but you want to be comprehensive and basically kind of idiot-proof it, so to speak. And as part of the reforms, FEMA did put together a appeal request form. Again, under the new regulations, a signed appeal letter is not required. In some cases, it might just be expedient to just include the document is all that's needed. If it's more complicated, it probably makes sense to include a written explanation of a situation, and that's where that can be helpful. So you can put that together yourself, or you can use this appeal form. Again, it's not required. Use it just to the extent that it's helpful. Basically, page one um, lets you put in all of your information, including your application number, contact information, and then page two lets you provide an explanation. Just make sure if you are handwriting it to make sure it's clear and legible. Because again, you don't want them trying to decipher what you're writing in addition to deciding what your situation is. And you can still attach documents to this as well. Um, but again, don't feel like you need to use this if it's more complicated, makes things harder for you. It should only make it easier. And so when you have your explanation again, consider using kind of the rule and then how it applies to your situation with your facts as a kind of a way to kind of work through a denial. Again, it could be a pretty simple one where it's just like they need an insurance claim letter. Here it is, and it's attached. Um, you don't have to necessarily overthink it. Just make sure you're answering what they're asking for and being thorough and not relying on assumptions. Um, when you're doing a written explanation, though, like you want to have a kind of a quick statement of why FEMA is wrong. Does not need to be complicated. Just basically, FEMA wrongly denied me for, dental reimbursement because I had, this caused, damage to my teeth during the event, and here's the dentist that fixed it, and here's the what the expense I incurred from it, and here's, copies of each of these things. Um, Simple, straightforward language. Again, you can use the appeal form um, and focus on the facts, not the law. Again, this is a non-lawyer deciding, not a judge. You don't need to be fancy. You just kind of want to explain your issue as if you were talking to the person next to you or talking to a friend at a coffee shop about what happened. Is just tell your story plainly and simply. You don't need to dress it up at all. And the more simply you explain it, I think the easier they'll understand it on the other end. You can describe any irregularities that happen with the process. So especially like with an inspection, if you or your family, English is not your primary language, and the inspector could only speak English or only, chose to speak English, you might be able to explain that something like that happened during an inspection, or that there's, roof damage, but the inspector couldn't see it because they aren't allowed to climb ladders and they aren't allowed to go underneath the structure. You can use this explanation section essentially or letter to kind of flesh that out because just sending the document might not tell that story. So you want to use this opportunity. And then you can also, briefly describe larger legal arguments or problems if you're running into other irregularities, things like that, or process issues, etc. And then the last tip would just be include your FEMA registration number on every page. If you're doing it in a Word document, you can put it in the header. That way it's just clear that this is still part of your appeal letter. This is still related to your FEMA claim um, for the housekeeping purposes. So that's kind of an overview. It doesn't get into necessarily the nuts and bolts, but they'll have some resources here at the end about where else you can go or who else you can contact. But hopefully that gives you just kind of a framework to operate from if you have to deal with one of these or potentially when you deal with one of these letters. And now I will turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you. Just one slide really quickly. That we don't want to talk about this too much, but we do want to make sure that that it is possible that FEMA will at some point review your account, review what they gave you, and determine that you were not eligible for what they gave you. And they will try to recover that. They will try to recoup that. This won't happen soon. This will happen in like a year or two, where they might actually take a close look at your, what they gave you and assess if you're eligible or not. We don't say that to scare you about something in the future, but so that you have knowledge in the present, to understand what these benefits are intended for. And so it's really important that you spend the FEMA money the way, that they intend for it to be spent, and the way that you request for it to be spent. So for example, if they are giving you money to replace a vehicle, or to replace your refrigerator or your bed, or some personal property. If you went out and bought some jet skis or some non-essential items that were not covered, whether you owned it before the fire or not, that would be a problem. And if they might not necessarily find out about that, but if they audit your account, or if they do find out about it, you would encounter trouble unless you were able to show, that you have receipts for the bed or for the car or for whatever the items they were replacing. And so, it's again very important for a long time to keep the receipts that you spend on your housing, on the property that you are replacing. You should be keeping all of these to be eligible for the FEMA money right now, but you should also be keeping, this proof and these receipts, to make so that you have cover, for if there's any ever question about how you spent your FEMA money. It's also good practice just to keep all these expenses that you're incurring related to the disaster, because besides FEMA, sometimes, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what programs might become available. Sometimes a nonprofit will arise, or the state might have some funding that they create that doesn't even exist right now, but that they'll have intended to support people impacted by the wildfires. And so, to the extent that you are able to show that you were affected, that you've spent this money, that you continue to spend money related to this, you might be able to get, support in other places. I mean, that's not a guarantee, that's not for sure, but it's stuff that we've seen happen before. And so, just to the extent that you can throw all of this stuff in a binder or in a plastic bag, or in a, file it away nicely, whatever works for you. If you keep that, that's a good way, to not only protect yourself, to prove, that you've spent these funds in the way that FEMA intended, but also for possible eligibility for other benefits down the road. If you did receive anything from FEMA, again, it probably wouldn't be anytime soon. The most common example is not necessarily the one that I just gave, but, what might happen is that you're trying to get FEMA and insurance at the same time. Both of them are giving you a problem. Both of them are denying you. Sometimes FEMA's denying you because of the insurance, but the irony is your insurance isn't paying you anything. Sometimes eventually you get the FEMA and you win. And then, remarkably, you might also wind up eventually winning and getting insurance. And so, to the extent that you wind up getting insurance, and FEMA has already dispersed some money that insurance would have covered, that's one that they find out about much easier. And so I think it's important to know that you're right to keep pursuing both things. If you get the FEMA money, that's great. However, if you wind up getting insurance or other assistance that might duplicate or cover the exact same thing that the FEMA covered, you really need to let FEMA know, because, again, otherwise you might wind up with this recoupment issue down the road. They're a federal body, so, they can pursue pretty fancy ways to try to collect their money against you. Again, not to scare you. And if that happens, there should be very clear appeal rights in that notice. And it would probably be another one of those situations where you should, or could be able to loop around with, Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, or other sources of help. But that's for another day, just to caution about how you spend the money today. So just like final takeaway thoughts here, it is so important to review all of the notices, all of the letters, everything that FEMA sends you. And sometimes you might be missing your mail, or not getting it all, or not able to open it all. If you're regularly using your online, the disasterassistance.gov login, sometimes, there's different pages that pop up first. You have to go specifically to the correspondence tab. Every now and then you'll go in there and you'll say, oh, I missed one. And I think there's like a red flag that says new, or something that really does catch your attention. You want to read all of those, because if you're not responding to the stuff in all of those. And again, sometimes each one says something different. That might, the one you're missing might be the exact one that you need to respond to really help them understand, what's missing, or why you should be eligible for these benefits. And again, there's all these different ways you can communicate with FEMA to give them more information, to appeal your decision, and to try to get more or any benefits from FEMA. So I think that concludes our big picture overview here.